Hi, ECON 345. Welcome to another fantastic week of content. I hope everybody's doing well. Reach out to me if you're not. I hope you remember the fact that we don't have in-person class this week since it is the Labor Day week, and because we're trying to split the classes in between the two different groups to be able to minimize the number of students in the classroom at a time. We don't have anyone in the classroom. Alrighty, so don't show up Wednesday. I will not be there, but we do have online content for you this week. So I'm going to go through a lot of the lecture notes and talk to you a little bit about what some of the more interesting parts of government budgeting is. You might, during this video, and this is fantastic life of a cat, you might hear a cat screaming at the door. That's because this is the third time I've attempted to record this thing, and that's because she kept doing this. That right there is a cat, and what you'll notice is that she's behind some sort of black box. That's behind this television. Twice while recording, she's decided to have a brand new game of jump behind the television and attempt to knock it down while Dr. Plemons is trying to record her 345 lectures. It's just okay. All right. So anyways, enough about my life and about my cat, who is adorable, by the way. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So give me 1 second. So, government budget analysis. Be glad that this isn't the week that I dragged you to class, because I cannot make a fun game out of government budgeting. I'm sorry. Actually, I probably can. This is a challenge. We might have a game related to government budget analysis, but government budget analysis is really important. You hear it on the news probably all the time, especially with it being an election season. They'll talk about, well, this is the deficit, and this is the total debt, and this is what's going on with this spending on this program, and we have to cut the spending to this program to finance these other programs. What does it all actually mean? So today we're going to take on our econ thinking caps and think a little bit about what does this language mean from an economic perspective, and what are some of the inherent issues that might arise, because maybe it's not always the fact that everybody's considering all of demand and supply and where indirect or direct effects might be happening. So we're going to start analyzing that. So there we go. Let me take you through 4 recent inaugural speeches. Well, recent. The first one's from Reagan, which I'm pretty sure Reagan was around before most, if not all of you were born. Anyways, Reagan said during his inaugural speech coming into office that his budget plan will ensure a steady decline in deficits, aiming towards a balanced budget by the end of the decade. His first year in office, the deficit was 2.6% of GDP. During his last year, it was 3.1% of GDP. Then later on, we had Bill Clinton come in, and Bill Clinton said, this budget plan puts into place the biggest deficit reduction in the history of this country. His first year in office, the deficit that he ran was 3.9%. His last year in office actually had a surplus. It's one of the only cases of surplus that we've had in modern record, right? And it was a surplus of about 2.4% of GDP. Next, let's talk about Obama. This budget builds on these reforms. It's a step we must come to take if we hope to bring down our deficits in the years to come. In his first year in office, his deficit was 9.8% of GDP. His last year in office was about 3.2%. Then Trump came in afterwards and said, we can do so much more with the money we spend, with 20 trillion in debt. The government must learn to tighten its belt, something families all over the country have had to learn to do. His deficit in the first year is 3.5%. The deficit in the most recent year we have data for, the 2018, is 4.2%. I'm terrified of the numbers of 2019, 2020, just because a lot has changed in the world that's been very expensive for government budgets, especially when we're starting to look at allocation in between state level and national level. But that's something we're going to get more into. So why do I even bring this up? Why am I pointing these things out? Well, first, let's go ahead and figure out what the difference in between debt and deficit is. Because everybody comes to me and they'll be like, the deficit is so large. I'm like, yeah, it is. And they're like, the debt is so large. But they tend to use these words interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So when we're talking about government budgeting, debt is the amount of money a government owes to those who have loaned it money. Now, this can be both international debtors, so the United States borrows a lot of money from other countries, or it can be national debtors. So the United States also borrows a lot of money or encourages saving from people that live within the United States. Okay, all right, so that's the debt, and that's this big giant pool of money. It keeps growing over time because the amount that we owe doesn't get paid down very often, right? It has accumulated and gotten higher and higher since about the 1960s, actually even before then. Deficit is the other word that people keep talking about. So notice in these inaugural speeches, I said deficit in terms of about the percentage of the GDP. That's because deficit is the amount by which a government's spending exceeds its revenue in a given year. So the deficit changes by year to year. It happens when we get to our numbers at the end of the year. We sit down with the paperwork and we find out, okay, how much did we spend through all these different programs, all these different expenditure sources, all of these different wars or anything else, how much did we spend versus how much did we raise. Now this can come in from personal taxes, corporate taxes, it can come from a wide variety of things, and we're going to get into what exactly those nuances are. But on this year-by-year basis, when we compare the spending versus the revenue, we get a number, and then we compare this number to GDP because it gives us an ability to notice how big that number is compared to everything that's happening within the economy. So what does this look like in recent years? Here I have a picture from 1965 to 2017. I am so terrified and excited to update these pictures in about a year or two, but we don't have that yet. So let's just looking from 1965 to 2017, and what we'll see is that at the beginning of this we had a fairly balanced budget that year. That year the expenditures and the revenues were relatively similar. But what do we notice is that over time, this red line, this expenditure line on top, tends to be a little bit higher than the green line of revenues. And we'll notice the more and more we're going over time, the larger these gaps have been, except for right here where we had a little bit of time where revenues outpace expenditures, but then we go right back to expenditures outpacing revenues. Each year, this deficit accumulates into the total amount of debt. What we'll see, so these are at the top, the expenditures and revenues. I have surplus deficits at the bottom where we see this line 0. That's a balanced budget where we spend exactly as much as we make in a year. And what we notice is that for a majority of the years, except for these few years during the Clinton administration, we've had substantial deficits that have accumulated over time. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means a lot, because this is money that does have to be paid back eventually, or it's money that we have to raise. If we end up spending more in one year than what we make, what do we do the next year? We raise taxes. Well, what does that mean when we're raising taxes 20 years in a row for the next generation of people to come in? That's something that we have to consider, and it's something that we have to figure out. So there's two types of spending in the budget process that we're going to talk about. The first one is entitlement spending, and the second one's discretionary spending. So you might hear a lot of these when you're listening to the news, or when you're, I don't know if you do this, when you're reading the annual budget. I love reading the annual budget because it lets me know where money's going. I read the one for my state and for my town and for the nation. So entitlement spending, these are mandatory funds for programs which the funding levels are automatically set. For example, if we're going to fund unemployment insurance, we're going to have to do that for the number of people who are eligible for unemployment insurance, right? We can't say, we're going to fund the first 3 million of you and then not the rest. Anybody who got their application and after that's done. No. Entitlement spending is we're assigning a mandatory amount of money for something that's based upon the number of eligible people. Social Security. We pay out Social Security every year, right? We don't go to the above 65 community or above 67 community or above 62, depending on when they decide to take it out and what sort of penalties they wanted. We don't go to this generation of people and say, well, we already paid the first 10 million people, and now we only budgeted for 10 million, so we're not going to give you money. That doesn't necessarily happen either, right? So entitlement spending are just these mandatory funds. They can't really be changed. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, this is the optional spending that's set at different levels each year. Kind of at the, I don't know why I word blanked right there, Oh, that's weird. But set at the appropriation levels by Congress each year. So this means that the budget's going to have to go through Congress. They're going to have to talk about it. This is why a lot of years we end up having shutdowns of government for a temporary period of time while they're still debating the budget. So all the non-essential things such as national parks and stuff like that have to temporarily shut down if they're still debating the budget past the deadline. We've seen it a lot in our lifetimes. This discretionary spending is where people tend to butt heads. So this is money for national defense, this is money for schools, this is money for a wide variety of other things. Okay? Discretionary spending often tends to align with the agenda of whatever the policy interventions that the president would prefer and that whoever the majority party in Congress at that time prefers. But they do have, everybody does have to work together and vote on this. So it is something that takes a lot of negotiation and a lot of time to figure out where this discretionary spending is going and what can be used, what level it should be used. Some groups have decided that, like, hey, we need to minimize discretionary spending because their deficit is ridiculous. So we're not going to fund a bunch of stuff that we used to fund before. While other people say that, no, we're going to spend everything. And our children and grandchildren are going to figure it out. And we have these two kind of opposing views that have to debate over the discretionary spending levels. So let's look at the composite of federal spending. So right here in 1969, discretionary spending, way back in the day, was a majority of the spending that was done with the national budget. A good bit of it went to defense, a good bit of it went to non-defense, right? Then we had kind of our mandatory spending. We spent money on major healthcare programs. So this is like different sort of programs that would help feed children in need or help feed elderly communities in need. We had a bunch of other social programs. We had Social Security. And at that time, life expectancy was lower. When we budgeted for it, we kind of expected people to not live as long, right? And Social Security originally came around back around the time of the Great Depression. And it was for the purpose of being able to help people once they were past the age of when they were thought to have exceeded their life expectancy and were unable to work. But we kind of left that same age as the cutoff, moving it slightly, but we've mostly kept the same age. But life expectancy keeps growing each year, which is great. That's awesome that people are living longer. But that means that it's starting to become taxing on Social Security too, right? Because that's larger and larger chunks of mandatory funding that's going to have to be paid by the government every single year. And that's why you always hear people debating saying, oh, well, Social Security is going to go bankrupt. Well, until we figure out something to do, it might be, because it will eventually get to the point where there's more people who are receiving money from Social Security than young workers who are paying into Social Security. So this is a balance that has to be figured out in our lifetimes, or else the budget may not make it past 2035 or 2050 at the latest currently. So, and back in 1969, a smaller percentage was spent on Social Security. Now let's move forward closer to our own time. And this actually comes from the Congressional Budget Office and a lot of their numbers that they've been reporting. In 2019, discretionary spending was much smaller. That's because a lot of the funds that we actually figure out every year when Congress determines its budget have already been promised. So a lot of it's more mandatory spending or this entitlement spending, such as for programs like Social Security or unemployment or a bunch of other things where they're kind of tagged to the number of people who are receiving them. But there is still some discretionary spending. About half of it tends to go to defense each year, and about half ends up going to non-defense projects of one form or another. It can be anything from helping agriculture farmers to trying to figure out what to do with giving money to particular states and cities to figure out how to deal with certain problems, or all the way to what are we going to be doing with NASA, right? There's a lot of discretionary spending things that we tend to have to debate each and every single year. So because, I need tea. Because our revenues, so the money that we bring in from taxes and some other sources, but primarily taxes, because revenues and spending, so spending such as insurance or other social programs, depend on the economy, The deficit changes even when policies do not, all right? So let's say we make no changes. We go into this next year and we say 2020 was a mess, so we're not going to change the budget at all. We're going to keep the exact same budget in the next year. Well, even if we kept the exact same budget in the next year, there's still going to be entitlement programs that are based upon the number of people that are using it, which might increase the deficit or decrease the deficit depending on what sort of program it is. There could still be different sorts of discretionary funds that aren't necessarily completely utilized. If so much money goes to FEMA, but there's no hurricanes in a year, well, then the money that's actually spent by FEMA that year is going to be reduced, or might skyrocket if there's some sort of major event happening, right? So the deficit's going to change no matter what. And a lot of this is because of environment, a lot of this is because of economy, and a lot of it's because of policy. So how do we adjust for this? When there's spiraling chaos or not spiraling chaos, or we have to figure out what to do very quickly in the event of emergency, what sort of economic conditions do we have for rectifying situations? Well, the first is automatic stabilizers. Right? Kind of wish my cat was sitting right here because I'd like lean back a little bit and she gets scared that the thing's moving, so she like digs in her claws. That's the idea of like an automatic stabilizer, right? It's an automatic reduction in revenues. So let's say that in a totally unrealistic example at all, that some sort of pandemic happened and a lot of people lost their jobs in a very short period of time. Right? Well, there are certain automatic stabilizers that would make it so it's like, oh, okay, all right, so we're going to kind of reduce taxes in these parts, and we're going to try to reduce a lot of these programs that we have going on. So the programs that may not be completely necessary, you are getting temporarily shut down right now because we need to conserve money because something's happening in the world. It's an automatic kind of reduction in the revenues. It's a little bit of a reduction in some of the spending, and we're increasing some of the outlays because when the economy shrinks relative to what we expected it to be, we need to adjust for that. Automatic stabilizers are just that. They're automatic. They have been put into multiple different budgets. They have been put into multiple different types of law and plans over time, so that if overnight, the Great Recession happens and the housing market completely drains, or if overnight a pandemic all of a sudden starts to shut down states, we have some sort of tools for addressing those situations. Now, automatic stabilizers are not necessarily helpful in the long term, right? Let's say that the economy is doing this. It's going up and down and up and down and up and down, but all of a sudden it starts being erratic. Well, the automatic stabilizers is to kind of help it be less erratic for a time, but that's not a permanent solution. The permanent solution isn't always, let's cut taxes, let's cut spending. Okay. Because there needs to be a more well-formed plan. That's the automatic stabilizer is supposed to be for short-term adjustments to make it so that we don't wake up the next day and 35% of the United States is unemployed, right? The next economic condition that we need to think about is cyclically adjusted budget deficits. So we tend to go through business cycles, right? We have our good times, and they're real good, and they're awesome, and everything's pretty all right. We're at almost full employment. There's lots of capital that's being accumulated. People are relatively happy, and then we have bad times where jobs are a little bit harder to find. The stock market is suffering. There may not be as much capital accumulation as some people are just trying to, meet their budget at the end of the year. So the cyclically adjusted budget deficit is a measure of the government's fiscal position in the economy if we were operating at full potential GDP. So it's letting us know, okay, where would we ideally be if everything was okay? So if a pandemic didn't happen and we were just kind of like at the point we were operating at full potential, and then we have the time when the pandemic does happen and we are not operating at full potential, what is that difference? And that difference allows us to come up with a lot of the strategies that we need to try to get back to this full GDP potential again in as short of a period of time as possible. So automatic stabilizers, like I said, they're really, really good for the short term, right? But not necessarily for long-term changes. Automatic stabilizers really kind of became popular in the 60s. That's when a lot of different changes happened. So during this time, check it out, we didn't really use much. The red line, the one that tends to be closer to the middle, these are the ones that are without automatic, or excuse me, yeah, without automatic stabilizers, and the blue ones are with automatic stabilizers, right? So without automatic stabilizers, we actually see that like we would have been okay. Things aren't the best, all right? And this is for kind of the budget, yeah? Or the amount of money coming in. So we see without the automatic stabilizers, there's still money coming in, but it's still decreasing. I mean, let's look at what's happening in 2008 and 2009 over here. With automatic stabilizers, where we end up cutting some payroll things and we end up trying to make it a little bit more friendly of an environment for people so that maybe they're not paying as high as taxes. We're trying to give people breaks. We're trying to give tax credits. At that time, the government ends up bringing in less money. This is this blue line right here. Let's see in the extreme of 2008, we're looking at a difference of like $14 billion versus $12 billion in deficit. So that's only an additional $200 billion in deficit. I say that like it's only. But we did have that time earlier this year where the Federal Reserve put $1 trillion into the economy, and the difference it made in the economy lasted for 6 minutes. And I'm going to be using that as an example until I die or retire. Okay, but anyway, so we see that there's not all these much of a differences on revenues, but these stabilizers are only supposed to help in the short-term adjustments. And what it ends up meaning is that we do tend to run larger deficits in those years. So let's think about accounting. How do we really know what the financial position of the government is at any given time? Because government and investment in assets can worsen the budget deficit, but sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does. Okay, all right, so I'm the government, and I decide that I would really, really like to have a government-owned firework factory. Yeah, so I decide to put in $200 billion into building this firework factory. Now, it might eventually make money. It might eventually not be as expensive, but I have promised $200 million to this project, and it's some sort of investment in an asset, in a factory, and it's kind of making my budget deficit worse because I'm spending a lot of money on that item, right? What types of accounting are we really talking about? Are we talking about just the physical money that I'm putting into this on a yearly basis? Are we thinking about the net present value of how much money am I spending versus how much money is it going to bring me in future years? That's something that we have to think about. So let's talk about cash versus capital accounting. First is cash accounting. Cash accounting is kind of a method of measuring the government's fiscal position as the difference between spending and revenues. That's a real easy one, right? It's how much money does the government have coming in cash? How much money are they spending in cash? It's money in versus money out. This is called cash accounting. It's not necessarily looking at giant capital accumulations. It's not looking at the fact of, oh, I'm spending this money on a giant factory, but the factory will eventually bring in money and be self-sustaining. Or I'm spending this money on a postal service, which eventually might be self-sustaining. Actually, technically, it's in the rules that they're supposed to be self-sustaining. That was a legal change back in the 90s. Anyways, long story. Capital accounting is a method of measuring the government's fiscal position that accounts for changes in the values of the net asset holdings. So cash accounting looks at just my bank account. It'll see, wow, I had a lot of money and I just spent $200 million on something. What? And it's comparing those cash values. It's like the money that you see on the ATM screen that you freak out at or you're really excited at when you see. Capital accounting is, okay, I'm looking at these differences. Wow, I spent $200 million on something? What did I spend that on? Oh, okay, we got a building that'll bring us $19.8 million over the next 5 years. Okay, and I start to put both of those numbers together. Cash accounting looks at how much money is in the bank account. Capital accounting looks at how much money is in the bank account, plus what am I really going to get from those assets? What's the net asset holdings that I have? So cash accounting kind of treats everything the same. It's like, wow, I spent money on an office party. Wow, I spent money on a birthday party. Wow, I spent money on a $200 million fireworks factory. And that's all kind of identical. Capital accounting doesn't treat it that way, right? It'll treat it as, this is kind of money lost, this is money in the investment of my employees, this is money spent on an asset that I will have some sort of net present value from over the next encouraging years. So, okay, so that sounds kind of neat, but there's still some problems with capital budgeting, right? Because at the end of the day, it's cool if I own a $200 million firework factory. It's cool if I own a whole bunch of things. But I need to know how much money's in my bank account. Bills need to be paid. Yeah, that's my own personal situation, but it also happens for governments too. Governments need to know how much money is actually in the bank account versus how much stuff do they own. So capital budgeting seems conceptually appealing. Honestly, I kind of like the idea, right? I like to know how much is in the bank account and how much stuff I own and how much that money is going to, or how much is the net present value of the future revenues of that good. But it's very hard to say when spending has increased the government assets. In the example of my fireworks factory, I can say, yeah, that's going to make me $19.8 million over the next 5 years, projected. That's easy to say. But what about a missile? If the government spends multiple millions of dollars on a missile, does that count as assets I have now? Does it raise the amount that I have in both cash and assets? Because it's something that I can only really use once. And it's something that's not going to bring in revenue on its own. It's not going to sit and run a taco stand and give me the profits, right? It's a missile. It's a different sort of device. So does buying this missile count as an investment? Does buying different laboratory equipment for the Environmental Protection Agency that they're going to use to protect wetlands and stuff, that doesn't necessarily bring me in money at any point. What's the net present value of having that asset? Does it have resale value? Does it not have resale value? It's very specific to only really the EPA needing it. So there's a lot of problems with capital budgeting, and that's in deciding what really counts as assets and in analyzing what the net value of those asset holdings are. This difficulty might make it easier for politicians to almost misstate the government's budgetary position. So you'll notice, pay attention. The next few times you watch the news, pay attention to someone telling you what the budget is, or what the budget deficit is, or how the Treasury is doing that year. Because you're going to get 3 or 4 different answers depending on what department they're from, what branch they're from, what political party they're from, and how close they are to looking at the Treasury's books versus the IRS's books. Because it's kind of difficult for everybody to know how each single one of these items count. It might be that whoever's in the presidential office decides that, okay, well, missiles would count as current asset investments and there's some sort of net asset holdings for that. While someone over at the Treasury or the EPA might be like, no, we don't necessarily agree with that. So this makes it very difficult for even people within government to necessarily be on the same page when it's on the capital budgeting part. So some states use capital budgeting. Some foreign countries use capital budgeting. There's pretty much mixed results. For some places, when there's a lot of accountability and a lot of transparency on what counts and what doesn't count, it tends to go pretty well. In other places, when there's no transparency at all, it tends to cause a lot of bureaucratic issues. Yeah. So, do current debts and deficits really mean anything? That's a good conceptual question to think about, right? Because as economists, we see, okay, we're taking out a lot of money each year, but we have to think, well, does this really matter in the long run? 500 years from now, is it going to matter that we were like 2 trillion in debt this particular year? Well, yes. It depends on what the money's kind of spent on, right? So if we're spending it all on things that we are consuming today, then what we spent it on may not necessarily matter as much tomorrow, but they're still going to have to pay it back or raise taxes to make up for that deficit. While if it's instead, I put all this money towards future programs, yeah, it might be 2 trillion in debt, but I gave every bit of that 2 trillion to paying for Social Security in the future or for free college in the future. Well, then that's a little different, right? That's not necessarily on goods that are getting consumed now. It's something that will be consumed later. So looking at these differences really affect the long run perspective of government budgeting, right? So many government programs create future expenses, even if they are not explicitly in law. Here, let's, where's the, I was watching the budget earlier, or no, let's look at this. So this is the fiscal year 2019 budget. I'll go up to the top so you can see it afterwards. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting in here, where is it? Is this purpose of comprehensive solutions to wildlife suppression funding. So the budget is responsible for 100% of the rolling 10-year average cost of wildfire suppression in the Department of Agriculture and the Interior, with discretionary budget caps. So what does this mean? Well, this means that yes, it's going to affect the amount of money that we're spending, but we're promising future funds too. So it'll look like in the deficit that we're spending money, but it's not necessarily money that gets spent right away, and it's not necessarily money that the caps are set, because it can be up to discretionary caps. It can change later. So there's a lot of unknown purposes and a lot of unknown pieces of the budget. So yeah, this was the fiscal year 2019 budget of the U.S. government. You know what? I'll put it on the blackboard in case any of y'all are interested, because going through that can give you ideas of the policy that you'll use for your policy brief. I'm probably going to put up a video about the policy brief in the upcoming weekend so that you can have a little bit of time to think about it. So I'll put up both. So many governments create programs that promise future expenses, and that it was for wildfires. A lot of the time they're promising money to FEMA or to the Social Security or to a bunch of other things, right? Which means that there are these impact obligations that are created. Impact obligations are financial obligations that the government has in the future that are not recognized in the annual budgetary process. I could promise that in 3 years, I'm going to give $3 trillion to NASA. That does not necessarily affect my annual budget, right? Because I promised that way down the road, but it's still going to affect some of my financial decisions. It's still going to affect how much money I'm projected to have in the future. So it's going to affect my financial position when it comes to getting loans or anything like that. A good example of this is Social Security payments, right? Social Security payments are promised far in the future. Most of the people taking this class right now are in between the ages of 18 and 23, I'm guessing. Please don't get mad at me over that. I'm just saying because that's typically what sophomore to seniors are age-wise. So most of this class might be in between the ages of 18 and 23. A lot of you will probably be working. We actually have a very high percentage of students that are working, which, by the way, I'm the internship coordinator for economics. So if you ever want to talk about different internships that you can work in economics, boom, I'm the person that you email. But right now you might be working a job and you're going to, assuming your employer has not taken the payroll deferral, you're going to have money that you have taken out for FICA each year, and it's going to go into the kind of this bin of money, which makes payments for people that are on Social Security. But in exchange, they have promised you that when you retire, that you will get Social Security. So it's kind of a paying it forward idea, right? So deciding whether to spend $1 this year or next year kind of affects the current deficit, but that dollar has very little impact on my financial decision. Promising you that you will have Social Security when you retire, which you may not, that really doesn't affect the budget today. Which, by the way, okay, back to the payroll deferral. If your employer has decided to take the payroll deferral, and that means that you're making 6.2% more on your paychecks right now, please understand the fact that as the rules are currently written, unless it is changed within the next few months, which is highly unlikely to do because of the way that, you know, Congress doesn't necessarily always get along, you will have to pay that back next year. As it is currently written, you will have to pay it back. So every bit of extra money you're getting on your paychecks, that like nice bonus 6.2% that you're getting right now, put it in a bank. Either talk to your employers and have them continue to take it out, or put it in a bank and have it sit there, because you're going to have to pay it back and you don't need an unexpected bill next year. So that's, you know, the economist and me talking of why hasn't more people read this bill where it's clearly saying that it's going to have to be paid back next year. All right, so impact obligations. Oops, I still have the budget open. So what does the U.S. government do, right? when we're figuring out all these budgets, I mean, I need to figure out how to budget for things. What do we really do? Well, the current approach is that we kind of score policies on a 10-year window. The Congressional Budget Office actually does a lot of this. So they're the ones that we get a lot of our data from. They take a lot of the projects and grants and ideas that we have, and they kind of score the reasonability of these policies, the feasibility of these policies, cost, other things like that. And they tend to do it over a 10-year window, right? So we score sections of the budget based upon this 10-year window. Now, before 1996, this was on 1- and 5-year windows. What does that mean? That means if the year right before Katrina didn't really have any bad hurricanes, they had a low amount of money they needed. So the next year, we would have given them that same low amount of money if it was on a 1-year term or on a 1-year window. Well, then Katrina happens, and they're really, really hurt because they have a below average budget because they were left at the same point of what they had used the year prior, right? When that might have been an unusually calm year. If instead they had looked at 5 years or 10 years before, they might have noticed that that was an unusually low year, but there were a lot of higher years. So the budget that should have been given for that year might have been a little higher, right? It's looking at these sorts of decisions on how we decide to kind of incorporate scores and also how we determine budgets moving forward. Yeah? So when we have this on a 10-year window, we avoid imposing assumptions about revenue expenditures. We avoid kind of assuming, it's going to be the same as last year. We instead say, well, we got to look at the last 10 years of data to figure out exactly what we should provide or what would be the recommended provision. It's not just based off of what happened the year before. But nevertheless, when we start thinking about 5-year periods or we start thinking about 10-year periods, it is very difficult to know what's going to happen in 10 years. Where was I 10 years ago? This would have been 2010. I would have been in my first year of undergrad, like fresh out of high school. I was going to work in finance. I was going to get an undergrad degree and I was going to just work in finance and that was going to be my life. And like since then I got a bunch of masters and a PhD and decided to become a professor. Back then I hated teaching so much that every time someone told me, you'd make a great teacher, I'd scoff and be like, teaching, right? And now I love it. You don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. And it's the same for budgets. You don't know what's going to happen with a budget in 10 years. So, for example, over previous 5-year periods, actual projected deficits can differ by more than $500 billion. Do you know how much $500 billion is? It's a lot. That is a lot of money. And projections can be off by that just because we tried to look at larger windows of time. So let's look at an example. From 1986 to 2017, let's look at the difference in between the projected surplus and the actual surplus. So the actual surplus is this one in blue, right? Notice the majority of it is in this pinkish area below zero, and that's because we ran a deficit, yeah? The green one, this one closer to the middle, is our projected surplus or deficit. Notice that our projected surplus actually goes positive a few times. And then it goes down, and then it goes up. We didn't really expect these good years right here, so the projected deficit existed when we actually had a surplus. We had a time right here where we had a surplus, but we projected a deficit because we were looking at the years that were really bad right beforehand, right? So we make a lot of our budgetary decisions based off of this projected surplus and deficit, but the actual surplus and deficit can be drastically different. Look, in between these years, it was 546 billion. In between these years, it was much, much larger, though in all fairness, that had the recession, so we have some sort of reason for why it was larger. It wasn't just willy-nilly-ness. This is something that we have to think about, because that means that right now we're not necessarily the best at projecting on what things actually cost, right? So why do we care about the government's fiscal position at all? Why do we care? Because you might be like, I don't know if I want to be a public economist. I keep hearing all these people talking about the deficit in the news. Why do I care about those things? You care about those things because the government's budget deficit has implications for both efficiency and intergenerational equality, right? Let's say that we have massive deficits, and we can't actually afford some of the programs that we thought we needed. So we can't necessarily afford some of the job training programs, and we can't necessarily afford some of the equipment that NASA needs to be able to do their job, and we can't necessarily afford some other things. Well, then the efficiency goes down, right? If we don't have the money to be able to pay for stuff, we don't have the stuff for people to work with. If we can't pay for the equipment for the EPA to do their ecological surveys, they can't do ecological surveys. If we don't pay the money to NASA to have, you know, spacecrafts, though I guess we technically don't really do that anymore, but if we don't pay the money for NASA to be able to do their research into other planets, how are they going to do the research into other planets, right? Efficiency goes down. It also affects intergenerational economy or equality. So if we run very large deficits, today's deficits are tomorrow's taxes. So if we spend more money than what we have, then that means in the future, that money has to be raised at some point because it was borrowed, but borrowed is a temporary thing. It eventually has to be paid back. These deficits have to come in line. So that means, what do? Well, then you need more revenue. How do you get more revenue? You tax your grandchildren 3 times as much. Yeah? Why are my glasses just better? Better. Okay, they were crooked and just driving me nuts. So budget deficits can affect the amount of savings and growth in the economy. If we run really, really large deficits, we're not saving money for future programs. We're not putting aside money so that Social Security might not be bankrupt. We're not, you know, having a lot of growth, because if we don't run surpluses every now and then, or if we don't reduce the deficit, then we're not necessarily also having this flexible amount of money that we can spend on projects that might help people, right? So high deficits today imply redistribution from future generations. Whenever we run a high deficit, we're really just borrowing money from future generations that are going to have much, much higher taxes to be able to pay off that deficit when it eventually happens. So it's kind of like kicking the can down the road. The problem is, you know, people have to get elected. And no one wants to elect the person that says we're going to raise our taxes now so that our children and grandchildren don't have to have taxes or as severe taxes in the future. That's a really tough thing to sell, right? Like, in this class, we don't take any sides on politics whatsoever, but that would be a tough position for any group to be able to sell. So what are some of the short run versus the long run effects on the macroeconomy of some of these issues, or of having deficits that might be too high or too low? What happens to the federal government? Because states have to have a balanced budget. Okay, I think Vermont technically can get out of it, but they don't. They have to have a balanced budget. The money they have come in has to equal the money they have to go out. National government isn't actually set by these rules, and there's some short run and long run effects of that on the macroeconomy. First is just some short-run stabilization issues, okay? So we have our business cycle, right? And we start to go through some stuff, and things are bad, and good and bad, and good and bad, and we put in these automatic stabilizers to try to bring it closer back to the normal flow, right? Well, the role of the government in combating the peaks and troughs of the business cycle, that can be wary. It's very difficult to make the correct decision at all, because you don't know every single piece that's happening in the economy at every single time. And then B, then you have programs that you never really get rid of, right? Back in 2008, the Federal Reserve set interest rates to almost zero because they wanted to encourage, you know, safe and supportive lending. That was supposed to last for a year or two. It is now 2020, and we still have barely ever seen interest rates over 0%. Okay, all of you probably have a savings account. I'm betting you don't make 1% on your savings account. I mean, I technically do because I've got E-Trade savings, and I think mine is like 1.5%. But most people don't have interest on their savings account. Do you know it's normal to have interest on your savings account? That's a normal thing. And most people have interest on their savings account few decades ago, back when that was more normal, because interest rates by the Federal Reserve weren't zero. They were higher than that, which means banks were higher than that, which means they had to incentivize people to save and really wanted money to come in, so they would offer interest rates. So these are some of the short run issues that we see, is like maybe savings rates for banking account or for savings accounts don't exist. Maybe some sort of other automatic stabilizations that were only supposed to be temporary end up staying for long periods of time, right? See, automatic stabilization, they're the policies that automatically alter taxes and spending in response to economic fluctuations. Like, oh no, oh, this isn't good. Okay, pandemic happened. So let's lower taxes for some people. Then we're going to spend more money on unemployment. And then we're not going to take care of the national parks. Like, just no. And then we're going to do other things. Well, the problem is it's very difficult to go back, right? It's very easy to make short-run changes, but changing them all back over time is very difficult because a lot of people debate on when events actually end, right? Like the Federal Reserve did officially give us an ending day for the Great Recession. I think it was late 2009 or early 2010. It was like shockingly early. What they put out was the official ending time. And all the economists disagree on it. Some of them think it happened before, some of them think it happened after. The thing is, policymakers also disagreed on it. So some wanted to keep the automatic stabilizations for longer, some wanted to keep them from shorter, and that causes a lot of issues with policy intervention. Next is the idea of discretionary stabilizations. These are policy actions taken by the government in response to particular instances of underperforming or overperforming economies. Back in 2008, Obama ended up giving a stimulus check to people. Back in, earlier this year, we, from the Trump administration, had a stimulus check come in that Congress had ended up approving. We technically were supposed to get a second one, but pretty much all talks and negotiations have stopped on that at this point, so we'll see what happens. But there's probably not going to be a second one. But there was one, right? This is called discretionary stabilization. It was the idea that we spent a lot of money and we gave people a stimulus so that they would be able to pay their bills and they would kind of start to restart the economy a little bit so that we could keep some of the jobs without no one buying anything ever and more people getting fired. That's why a lot of the different policy actions that are happening for like small business loans and things like that are happening right now, and is to try to keep the economy temporarily afloat during this period of underperformance. So that's kind of interesting. So technically what would be best for economic growth is to have some amount of savings, but also to have some amount of money that's spent on things, and to not have a lot of compounding deficits, but to sometimes have surplus and sometimes have deficits, right? So when we think about savings and economic growth, basically what the equation works out to, and if you ever want, we can go back to like the original Solo model that thought about productivity versus capital versus labor and how that has the economic production curve. That's super cool, and if you get to that level of econ, please let me know, because economic development is awesomely fun. But basically what the equation works out to is that when you have more capital, you get more growth. Capital accumulation is a key part of economic growth. Okay. If, let's say I have 5,000 workers, and I need to build a railroad. Okay, if I put all 5,000 workers digging, they will eventually dig a trench long enough for me to put the railroad there. What if instead I have a few hundred digging, but then I have the other ones working on some machinery for an automatic digger? They make the automatic digger, and then it just whoop, and it digs the entire trench in a much shorter period of time. Well, then all 500 people can go work other jobs, and they can do other things that create growth, because this one thing's done and they're more efficient, and now they have this cool machine that they can use on any of the railroad things, which is much faster than everybody doing it themselves. Capital, remember, is the tools. It's the pizza oven when making pizzas. It's the trench diggers. It's the computers that I use to record this class. Having capital and accumulating capital is a really important part of economic growth, because these tools make our jobs way easier. You can sit in this class right now because you are not sitting there having to wash and dry and wring all of your clothes one by one by hand and stitch things yourself, and then go and grind your own wheat and make your own bread and then slaughter your own cow for a burger. You don't have to do that, because we have a lot of capital tools that allow this to make it an easier process so that we can have trade, right? Right? Isn't that cool? So we want capital. The way we get capital is by saving. I could pay 500 workers to all go dig a trench right now. Or I could pay 200 workers to dig a trench, save a little bit of money, keep saving, spend it on capital so that there's some research and design to be able to get a trench digger, and then have the trench digger go. Well, it means that I do have to temporarily save money, right? As there's more capital in the economy, each worker ends up being productive. If I have one person with a shovel, it's going to take them forever to dig a railroad trench. If I have 10 people with shovels, it's going to take them forever to dig a railroad trench. If I have one person with a trench digger, that one person is way more productive than the one person with a shovel, right? And total social product rises when we start to have these capital tools. So a large capital stock means more total output for any level of labor supply. So if I have one person, that one person can do more if I give them the right tools. If I have 10 people, those 10 people can do more if I give them the tools. Thus, growth in the capital stock drives per capita growth because it's making each individual unit of labor that much more productive. All right, so the more saving, more capital argument. What determines the amount of capital that's actually accumulated? What determines the amount that we end up saving? Well, a lot of that is interest rates, right? Notice I said earlier, like, I have 1.5% interest rate on my savings account. It's actually pretty normal to have interest rates in your savings accounts. We just haven't seen them in a long time, like since 2006, 2007-ish, right? The higher the interest rate, the more people want to save. If I told you, hey, you can use I'm giving you $100. You can either spend the $100 and have a real fun weekend, or if you put the $100 in the bank and you leave it in the bank for a month, I'm going to pay you an extra $10. So you're going to be able to pull out 110 afterwards. Well, then you're incentivized. If I tell you I'm going to give you a couple pennies, you might not be incentivized. If I tell you you're going to get $10, you're like, yeah, okay, I can wait a month. I'm going to put my money in that. So interest rates determine how people save. Isn't that cool? Or even if people want to save, interest rates determine a lot of that. In competitive capital markets, equilibrium is determined by the intersection of this demand for savings and the supply of investment curves. All of you have had to have taken principles of macro to be here. I actually am an applied microeconomist. I do not teach macro at all. So please go back to those notes and, look at your supply curve, look at your savings curve again, because it might be really interesting if you want more background into this information. But I'd give you everything you technically need in this class and the lectures. All right, so now we have our federal budgets that we were talking about. Now we have this new little piece of interest rate. We're talking about economic growth because economic growth is great, right? There's a reason why technically we are wealthier than our parents were and our grandparents were and our great-grandparents were, and a lot of that's due to economic growth. We have more efficient refrigeration, we have more efficient cars, we have it so that, a lot of different things. TVs are smaller and they're cooler and they have better range of color. Things just change over time. Growth happens, and a lot of it happens when productivity and technology changes. So suppose a fixed supply of saving is used to finance both the capital of private firms and the borrowing of government. So let's say that all of us get together and we decide, oh, you know what? Dr. Plumman's lecture was so convincing that we're all going to start saving together, and we all put, money into a pot. Well, if that pot has to, both be the private savings, so the money that people have independently in bank accounts and corporations have in bank accounts, and the money that the government's kind of saving that they can use for things. Well, the more government borrows from that pot, that means that there's less and less savings, or the supply of savings in there, to go to the private sector to work on a lot of this research and development for private sector things like trench diggers or what's it called? Vaccines. So this increase in interest rate can kind of crowd out borrowing by the private sector. So if that essentially means as savings goes up, as the interest rate goes up, we might be more incentivized to save. But if the government uses a lot of that, then that means that there's less money to go to being able to help finance a lot of research and development through loans or other sorts of capital accumulation for the private sector, which actually can lead to lower levels of capital accumulation. So in reality, there's a number of complications with the government budget, right? There's some good parts, there's some bad parts, there's some deficits that are terrifying, and we have to think about what's happening to the future versus what's happening to us, what's the net present value, what is a deficit today and a tax tomorrow, and what do these relationships look like, right? And there's a number of complications of how government financing affects the interest rate and growth for these. And we have evidence of that too, right? theory, so the base economic theory that we've been working on for the last 450 years tells us that deficits lead to higher interest rates. That is the base core fundamental part of economic theory. And when we have these higher interest rates, we have less capital investment. But it doesn't tell us how much higher or how much less. It doesn't tell us how much higher the interest rate is going to go. It doesn't tell us how much less the capital investment is going to go. A lot of what economic theory tells us is a direction. We know if something's going to go up or down, but we don't know how much up and down. And that's what we have to prepare for, or what we have to try to predict. And that's why we use a lot of econometrics. If you keep up with economics, we start running the numbers and we start making charts and we start forecasting these things to figure out how much. We know up and down. We know demand goes up and down. How much does it go up and down? And then you eventually learn that, and it's kind of neat. So the existing literature on the question of the relationship in between government budgets and interest rates is inconclusive. We have some recent evidence that suggests projected long-term deficits appear to be reflective in some extent of long-term interest rates. We have some evidence that sometimes when there's drastic fluctuations that there's issues with short-term interest rates to the point where sometimes they might pay you, like just pay you additional money to be able to hold money for short periods of time by large amounts that were more than what we expected. Investments and savings are weird. And they're weird because we don't always know to what magnitude these interest rates and capital accumulations or capital investments are going to change. And a lot of that's because of just government budgets. The larger the deficit is, the larger the debt is, the more we have to pay off, the more we're outpacing spending by earnings each year, the more and more we end up having this money that's already in consolidated budget buckets, which are kind of promised to one thing or another, and it leads to some sort of long-term implications of what usable funds are going to be. All right. With that, please enjoy the rest of your week. Have a great one. Come by office hours if you want. I'm always down to hang out and tell you all about public economics. It's a lot of fun. Remember that you do have a homework that's due. I'm going to have another video that's going to go up in the next few days that's going to discuss a little bit about the background of our project and what the project's going to look like this semester. All right, everybody have a great one and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.